Hello and welcome to the course on Introduction to the Psychology of Language. I am Ark Verma. I am a professor of psychology and cognitive science at IIT Kanpur. In this week, we have been talking about various aspects related to introduction to language. What does it mean to know a language? Whether a language is similar or different to animal communication systems? What are the basic concepts that we need to know about when we are setting on the scientific study of language? And also a little bit about the evolution of language that we did in the last lecture. In the final lecture of this week, we are going to talk about the relationship between language and thought. As I said in the opening lecture, that it's almost like a chicken and egg problem. Which comes first? Does the thought come first and then the sentence is formulated? Whether the sentence is formulated is exactly the thought itself. Say for example, we all of us talk to ourselves, all of us think in our heads, all of us are constantly sort of doing a commentary on whatever is going on in the world. Sometimes that commentary is inside and sometimes that commentary kind of comes out through the movement of the physical apparatus and in words and is heard by others. Okay, so people have thought in great deal about the relationship between language per se and thought, and in some sense, if you really see, how you define either also depends upon how you see the relationship between these two items. So let us see what kind of work has been done in this particular area. Do you often talk to yourself, or say for example, are you thinking? That's an interesting question the way Traxler puts it, because he says talking to oneself and thinking has sometimes been equated with each other. A lot of times people think that they are one and the same thing. Okay, the other possibility is that they are slightly different things. However, behaviorists like John Watson and B.F. Skinner, they were of the opinion that talking to oneself is exactly what thinking is, and they are one and the same thing. So people wanted to test this out. In 1947, a team of medical doctors, they found a particular healthy volunteer. They kind of convinced the volunteer so that they could inject curare. Curare is a particular poison that when you inject in the part of the body, paralyzes that part of the body. So they injected curare or this poison and paralyzed the throat muscles of this healthy volunteer. 4 minutes after the injection was administered, the throat muscles and the neck and adjoining areas were paralyzed, and this person completely lost his ability to speak. If going by what Watson and Skinner were thinking, the loss of this ability to speak should have or could have resulted in a loss of the ability to think as well. That was not really that happened. This particular volunteer could clearly perceive whatever was going around him at that point in time, even though the areas responsible for affecting speech were completely paralyzed. Based on this volunteer's description of his experience, the researchers concluded that the paralysis of the speech muscles or the speech producing muscles had no effect on the volunteer's ability to perceive, think about, or remember what was going on during that episode when this poison had been injected. This could sort of amount for evidence that speaking and thinking are not dependent on each other. The other approach could be that speaking and talking to oneself are exactly one and the same thing. So that is also something that can be asked, and you can kind of reason about this a little bit. However, we know that there are individuals who have lost the ability to speak or understand language, but they're still able to think correctly. They are still able to think clearly and be able to perform tasks that requires different kinds of thinking. Say for example, there was this case of French monk, Brother John, that Traxler discusses, who was experiencing these periodic failures to speak or to understand spoken or written language as the result of these epileptic seizures that he was experiencing periodically. During these episodes, what used to happen was that Brother John was incapable of speaking coherently or even writing, but his ability of thinking remained untouched. He could think clearly, he could plan, he could act, but he could not really understand or communicate using language. Subjectively, Brother John, this particular monk, also reported the inability to produce inner speech. So for example, if I close my mouth and I'm still saying something to myself, that is also not what Brother John was able to do under these episodes. So that part was also not really working. However, During these episodes, he could still identify familiar objects. He was able of handling complex tools, maybe just like a hammer or a scissor. He was able to carry out instructions that was given to them before the seizure had set in. Remember, during the seizure he is not able to understand any language, but if you tell him that once your seizure starts you have to go and, let us say, take this medicine, he would be able to do that. So he must be able to plan and think and act, at least in that sense. Okay, he could also perform long and short multiplication and division, and in that sense his mathematical ability also preserved. Further, he could also remember events that happened while his language abilities were incapacitated, and he could later tell you stories about what was going on, what was he feeling, what was his thought process like. Okay, so for example, there is this quote where he says that I could think clearly within my inner self, but when it came to talking to myself, I experienced difficulty finding my words. So it's slightly difficult to understand what this exactly means, but apparently thought does not really depend on these linguistic structures called words, if you were to go by this evidence. Okay, so cases like this, that of Brother John, are a demonstration that one does not need language to think, where thinking is defined as this ability to reason, plan, make decisions, etc., to act in a particular way. So it does not, say for example, thinking probably does not necessarily depend on these linguistic structures. So that is one. There are other examples as well which demonstrate that you do not need to think particularly well in order to use language. So this one showed you that you do not need language to think properly. Let us look at some examples which will show you that you do not need thought to use language properly. Okay, there's the other way around. So there is this disorder called Williams syndrome, which basically results in in a particular kind of abnormal brain structure and brain functioning, as well as a particular degree of mental retardation. However, interestingly, severe mental limitations that patients of Williams syndrome face, they do not really appear to cripple their ability to use language. So even though the Williams syndrome patients will not be able to carry out simple tasks, add 1 + 1 = 2, etc., but they will be able to speak very fluently, they will be able to use language completely effortlessly. Traxler takes up this example of a woman who was unable to do basic arithmetic calculations or retrieve a small set of objects. If you ask her to fetch me this pen, she will not be able to do it, but when you ask her to talk, she will be able to talk in a perfectly coherent, comprehensible way that would almost make you feel that there is nothing wrong with this person. This is one kind of patient. There are other kind of patients as well, say for example patients of Down's syndrome, which is also a genetic anomaly that causes a degree of mental retardation. Therein people have found that some kind of language problems are there, but Williams syndrome people kind of do way better than these Down syndrome patients. All in all, if you look at some of these cases, it has been demonstrated. So you do not need language fine to be able to think properly, and do not need thought fine to be able to use language properly. And this kind of a situation is referred to in neuroscience as the situation called double dissociation. Suppose, say for example, if you have a patient deficient in doing task 1 but can do task 2, and patient B is deficient in doing task 2 but can do task 1, this is treated as an evidence for understanding that task 1 and task 2 are typically based on distinct neural abilities, distinct cognitive abilities. To know more about this, you can refer to one of the lectures in a different course that I have given on basic cognitive processes. But the idea that I am trying to get to get across is that there is enough evidence, clinical and otherwise, that tells us that language and thought are not exactly the same thing, and they are different from each other. Okay, so at least that is there, and if you've kind of specified that one out, then what you can talk about is how are these two related. So different people have opined and given different interesting theories about how language and thought might be related. So let us kind of look at some of these theories. One of the most interesting theories about how language and thought might be related was put forward by Edward Sapir and B.L. Worf, and they developed this idea, and they proposed that the kind of language we are using has a very profound influence on the way we think. So the structures that our language has, say for example that our language permits us to talk about the future in a particular way, past in a particular way, our language has a particular word for describing this beautiful object or describing a particular action or putting an abstract noun in some sense, has an effect on how we think. We can think only as much as our language may allow. So that was pretty much this whole thing, and you can word it in a different way and you can say that the proposal was that language determines thought. Okay, this was this particular proposition has been named as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, or as a version of linguistic determinism, where language determines thought and other and the way other cognitive functions might act. Now, where were these people coming from? Where was Edward Sapir and B.L. Whorf coming from? One of the sources of this idea probably could have been, as Traxler points out, was this description of the Eskimo language that was published by Franz Boas, which kind of led to this belief that English just has one word for snow and Eskimo language has more than one word, 2 words, 3 words, different words for snow, and because this language has so many words for snow and this language has just one word for snow, the experiences of the speakers of this language with respect to snow might be very different from as compared to the experiences of speaker of this language, that is English, as far as snow was concerned. So you see what is happening here is that the other language is allowing you to experience different nuances of snow, and it has different words for it, but this language is kind of limiting your perception and appreciation of what snow is. Okay, so this is what led to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Whorf proposed that because Eskimos had more experience with snow, they may have carved up this single concept of snow into many different sub-concepts and consequently developed different words for each of these sub-concepts. Okay, in that sense, English people, say for example people from these English speaking countries or English language, might not have those many experiences with snow, so their understanding and appreciation of snow can be just condensed into just one single word. Okay, probably also hinting that they cannot appreciate those different aspects of snow which the Eskimos can. Okay, so that distinction is being made. However, this whole idea was misfounded, which became clear when Geoffrey Pullum, a Scottish linguist, demonstrated the flaw in these assumptions. He kind of demonstrated that A, Eskimo languages do not have more words for snow than English, and B, there is no evidence that speakers of Eskimo language versus speakers of English really have any differences with respect to perceiving and interacting or thinking about snow. So he kind of showed that, say for example, Eskimo language only has 2 words for snow. One is kanik, that is snow in the air, and another is aput, that is snow on the ground, and that's typically the most distinction they make between 2 kinds of snow, let us say. Okay, English has just one word for snow, which is again not really very different. So the point being that this whole idea of language really limiting somebody's your perception and thought with respect to particular objects might not really be a very feasible idea, might not really be something practical to hold on with. Okay. So let's move on. Let's see, that was that. Many researchers have also in that sense looked for evidence of linguistic determinism in other areas, say for example in areas of say for example emotion perception or color perception. Say for example there are commonalities in perception of both emotion and a similar organization of emotional vocabulary across human cultures despite differences in language and culture. Say for example that already trumps this whole idea of that because different languages have different words for these emotions, they are probably in some sense mutually unintelligible, or people experience emotions in different ways. That's not really the case. In perception of color, it's slightly more easier to see. You can say for example if you read, you will find that most languages have 7 or fewer basic color terms, and then the other terms are mostly combination of these basic colors. Say for example, in the languages that just have two terms for color will be black and white, then the other words might come in, so you have black, white, and then you might have another term for red, and then for yellow or green, and similarly the third level colors like blue, brown, which are again mixes of these basic colors start coming up. So in that sense, there is this thing that people have similar terms for classification of color in these different languages. Sometimes this similarities in how people are classifying colors or perceiving or categorizing color probably comes from the physiological commonalities across the human species as well. We know that there are cones in the eyes that help us perceive color. We know that there are these they do it in a sort of opponent process mechanism. So for example, black, white, blue, yellow, red, green. I've talked about this in a different course. I'm not really going into a lot of detail, but there is a certain degree of commonality in how people universally perceive and categorize color, and that is what is reflected in the language anyways. So given this, if you have this background, it is easy to understand why people, even though who speak different languages, may perceive the color in very similar ways. Okay. Now that is said, it almost seems like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is untenable, and we don't really want to have any version of that. But if you look more closely, there are interesting instances that appear that kind of point towards that there might be at least some truth in what Sapir-Whorf were trying to say at that point in time. Say for example, Alfred Bloom says that the claim that language or languages we learn determine the ways we think is obviously untenable, but it does not really follow that language does not interact with the subject matter at all. It's not necessarily follow that language is just a code system that neither affects the processes by which thinking proceeds, nor it affects the nature of the thoughts manipulated in this in this communication process. So obviously language does interact with the content, it does interact with how this content is drawn up, and that is something that people have probably started finding evidence for. We'll take up some of these examples. You can say that, say for example, while the strong aspect of linguistic determinism is not really feasible, you can say that people have found some support towards the fact that, say for example, language may be affecting maybe influencing some of these non-linguistic perceptual and thought processes. Okay, or that speakers of one language may differently perceive certain particular aspects than speakers of the other language, and it has been tested in a range of different perceptual and cognitive tasks. So let us take up some of the examples of this kind. Say for example, let us take Chinese. Two things: counting skills and counterfactual thinking. Say for example, in Chinese the numbers starting from 10 are represented in a very transparent manner. So we have 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 in English. In Chinese the equivalents are like 10, 1, 10, 2, 10, 3, 10, 4 and so on. Obviously this latter version is much more transparent, and it makes it much more easier for children to acquire this kind of counting. So Chinese speakers of Chinese acquire counting after teens slightly more easily than the English speaking children, and that might have consequences for the way they count large number of stuff and so on. Okay, so that is something there. Interestingly, there is also an example in Piraha which does not really have number terminology per se. So they do not really have words corresponding to Arabic numerals like 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. What they have is they have words for less or more. They have fewer and more than. So they generally probably are not really counting exact number of things, but they have a sense of that grossly things are of the same quantity, or something is lesser than this quantity or more than this quantity. Now what does this imply? It implies that apparently the lack of these number words leads to the Piraha people's inability to specifically remember the exact number of, or the exact quantity of particular objects. They might be able to say, for example, tell you that this bunch of fruits is more than this bunch of fruits or lesser than this bunch of fruits, but maybe they will not be able to tell you count, because their language does not have words, that this is 5 or this is 7 or this is 9 and this is 5, something like that. Okay. More specifically, you will see that when the task involves direct perception of objects involved and does not require maintaining information in memory, Piraha do as well as speakers of other language. But when the task requires maintaining objects in the memory in such a way that they have to say, they have to anchor the exact quantity and bring that back in a different task, that is where the Pirahas suffer. Okay, and it's not really completely counterintuitive, in a sense that you see that the number terms actually act as anchors for that specific amount of quantity. If you do not have number terms, you will obviously not be able to talk about the exact amount of that quantity. That is what I am trying to kind of say. That's what really happens here, and in that sense it may be concluded that therefore while language may not affect perception directly, languages allow a speaker to encode knowledge in a form, anchor quantity in a form in the case of Piraha, such that it is relatively easy to maintain. Okay, so at least there is some evidence that language kind of affects particular cognitive functions in particular ways, not completely but in particular ways. Okay. Another example, interesting example in Chinese is that Chinese language, Mandarin in that sense, probably does not really have counterfactual statements. Say for example, Bloom demonstrated this very interestingly. He says a Chinese speaker might state explicitly, John did not take linguistics, and then later if he did, then he was excited about it. In English, it would say, for example, he will not be able to say this. In Chinese, what they will say is, if he had taken linguistics, he would have been excited about this. So in the former sentence, you see there is a statement of implication. John did not take linguistics. If he did, then he was excited about if he took linguistics. So that's a supposition that is there. You see in Chinese, if he had taken linguistics, he would have been excited. This is the Chinese version of it. So some sort of counterfactual thinking is not permitted by the language. Let us look at this in more detail. So when English and Chinese speakers were tested on counterfactual reasoning, Bloom showed that while about 3/4 of the English speakers were willing to accept a counterfactual statement, only about 1/4 of Chinese speakers were found to be willing to do so. Bloom reasoned that such a pattern would have happened because the Chinese speakers could not completely comprehend the questions that were being asked. The questions that were asked were, say for example, if all circles are large and if this is a small triangle, if this small triangle were a circle, would it be large? So for example, you have to assume that if this triangle became a circle, will it be large? So a sort of counterfactual operation has to be done here. In Chinese, however, it will be much more simpler if it was, the Chinese equivalent is, if all circles are large, if this small triangle is a circle, is this triangle large? So here there is no supposition. The former case is slightly more difficult for the Chinese students to understand, because their language does not permit that kind of counterfactual reasoning. So the forms that the two languages allow for, you can conclude that makes some aspects of reasoning more easy for the speakers of that language. So aspects of counterfactual reasoning might be more difficult for Chinese students in comparison to the English speaking students. Okay. We can move further. Finally, there is also some evidence that some aspects of color perception may not be universally present across human species. So say for example, while the English language does not distinguish between different shades of blue, Russian has different words for light blue and dark blue. Say for example, the lighter blue colors are referred to as goluboy, whereas dark blue colors are referred to as sinai. So consequently, when Russian speaker needs to talk about a blue object, he will need to decide whether he is going to talk about light blue or dark blue, whether he is going to use sinai or goluboy. They tested this out, Winover and colleagues, in 2007, and what they did was they gave they had this two groups of speakers, Russian speakers, English speakers, and they have a very interesting task. The task involved them having a placard. On this placard there was 3 squares. Is a top square and there are 2 squares at the bottom. So this top square could either be light blue or dark blue, and these bottom could both be light, both be dark, or one light and one dark. So either ways it could be there, and the task was that the people were supposed to check which of the two squares from the bottom was exactly same as the square on the top. So you have to look at this square, compare this square with this and this square, and tell us which of these squares is exact same color. Now if language were to have no effect on the perception of color, and that is what these speakers these researchers assumed, there should be no difference in the performance of English versus that of Russian speakers. But if it has, English speakers should find the task more difficult than the Russian speakers, because the Russian speakers will probably be able to distinguish very quickly because they have different words for the two colors. Indeed, that was something that they found. So Russian speakers were found to be faster and more accurate on judging the squares, where some of the colors were on opposite sides. So as soon as there was distinction to be made between Goluboy and Sinoy, because the Russian people had words, they could do it completely. They actually found it more difficult when they were on the same side. English speakers had no problems and were just as accurate no matter whatever arrangement of colors appeared, because they were kind of just having one word, and they were not really in this business of distinguishing these two colors. Now this kind of gives us an example of that maybe language does impact other cognitive functions or performance of other cognitive functions in certain slightly similar ways, not really very strong ways as Sapir and Worf would have imagined. Okay, so all in all, the take home message is that the relationship between language and thought demonstrates for the most part that language does not really affect the the way one perceives the world, but it might make certain tasks easier or more difficult. It might affect in more less powerful ways in that sense. Though the evidence both for and against are both to be treated carefully, keeping in mind the kind of task that is being done, the people that are the subjects, and also the test materials that have been used. So one has to kind of take all of this with a pinch of salt, and I am not really sure whether this debate is actually solved. So there is constant work between language and thought, and the different kinds of experiments people are still doing in order to etch out this relationship between how language and thought are related to each other. So this will be the end of this week. I have tried to talk to you about different aspects of what the basics of language have to be about, and kind of did some homework for some of the lectures that are going to come later as well. Thank you.